Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome and thanks for joining us for today's session titled Lessons in Leadership. This afternoon, we're excited to have with us two very accomplished individuals who also happen to be former student athletes to share their thoughts on various facets of leadership as experienced throughout their career journeys. Jene Elzie and Oliver Luck have unique career paths and will share their respective pearls of wisdom with us as our members navigate your own journey within the intercollegiate enterprise. Our session moderator, Jene Elzie, is a two-time graduate of Stanford University, where she was an All-American gymnast, currently serving as Chief Growth Officer for Athletes First Partners. Elzie is responsible for developing, implementing growth strategies across international and other non-traditional revenue streams for the agency. She has over 2 decades of experience as a global sports and entertainment executive, previously serving in roles with the NBA as both Vice President of International Marketing and Vice President of Marketing and Communications for Europe, Middle East, and Africa, as well as similar international roles with NBC Universal and Comcast. Jene, thank you for joining us today. Our speaker, Oliver Luck, is certainly familiar to many joining us today. Oliver's had a notable career in athletics administration at many levels. Within the intercollegiate athletics, Luck previously served as Director of Intercollegiate Athletics at his alma mater, West Virginia University, before being named Executive Vice President for Regulatory Affairs with the NCAA, a post he held until 2018. A former collegiate and professional quarterback, Luck has also been successful in the professional ranks, serving in high leadership positions with the NFL, Major League Soccer's Houston Dynamo, and most recently, Commissioner and CEO of the XFL. Oliver, we appreciate you taking time to be with us today, and we look forward to your insights. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you, our live attendees joining on Zoom, that you can ask questions throughout the session by using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. We will respond to as many questions as possible at the end of this session. I'd also like to thank our sponsor of today's session, Paciolan, a leader in ticketing, fundraising, marketing, analytics, and technology solutions with more than 40 years of experience. Paciolan has been a longtime supporter of NACDA, and we appreciate the strong relationship that we have built through the years. That said, I will now pass the baton off to Jene to begin the conversation. Thank you both again very much.
So thank you, Bob, for that handoff. Oliver, it's good to see you again, as always.
Thank you, Jene. It's a pleasure to be with you, and let me thank Bob as well. Thanks, Bob.
Fantastic. So I don't really think that there's anyone better to talk to about leadership. And I really, I wanted to start off just, this year, coronavirus, economic recession, social unrest, political unrest, wildfires in the West. So if you could tell us in sort of a sports analogy, how would you sum up the year so far?
Well, it's been a crazy year for almost everybody, regardless of where you are geographically or chronologically, where you are with your career. And I think it's one of those moments that forces everybody to take a step back and maybe reassess things and really realize what's important. But I guess if I had to do a sports analogy, it would be someone who is just about, an athlete, of course, who is just about to start a season. Doesn't matter what sport, just about to start the season. You've trained, you're prepared, and guess what? You get injured, right? We've all faced that as athletes over the years. You get injured, and you might be out for 6 weeks. You might be out for 8 weeks. You might get put on injured reserve, if you're a pro player, but you're not part of that team. You're in that never land, that sort of purgatory between, being healthy and not quite being healthy. You're in the training room perhaps a little bit too much. You begin to lose touch with your teammates and coaches, because if you're not part of that team, you sort of get pushed to the back. And then you're ready to come back. And just as you're ready to jump into that game, guess what? You get hurt again. And it might be the same injury. It might become a nagging injury. It might be something different. And you never seem to get in sync. You never seem to get in that rhythm that all athletes really need, I think, to perform at their peak. So to me, it's one of these injury-ridden seasons that aren't really very comforting to anybody. They're frustrating, and not just to the athletes themselves, but to fans, to coaches, to others. And gosh, just this morning, waking up to the news that a couple of the NFL teams, the Titans, my old team, of course, I'm an old Houston Oiler, but the Titans and the Vikings, both with, COVID cases. So, maybe we're starting to see that as well hit the National Football League that up until now had done a pretty good job. So it's just one of those incomplete years. If the Queen of England were to comment on it, she would say it's an annus horribilis, right? Which is the word she used way back when. But it's just a tough, really tough year. And hopefully we're not at the end of it, but hopefully what we see the next, few months gets a lot better.
Yeah, and you're giving me a little bit of flashbacks to college, of course. Being familiar with injuries. I think one of the other things that's really interesting is, as you kind of build the picture around being injured, one of the things that happens is you kind of have to start building up different muscles, right? Just in the way we were just talking about the fact that all of a sudden the entire world seems to have transferred to Zoom. And, I think there's going to be a lot of ways that we have to adapt. And so, I want to start, though, taking us back to the week that really changed everything, certainly in sports, right? The week of March 9th. So March 11th, we had the NBA cancel its game, its season, suspend its season. And then we had the NCAA, of course, right after that, coming out with their big announcement around March Madness. So can you take us back to that week? What was going on for you in particular, and what you kind of made of that at that time?
Sure. So that week was really an incredible week, I think, as people look back on it now, and certainly years from now when they look back and see how much was just stopped, right, almost immediately. It's inconceivable. But of course, I was the commissioner of the XFL at the time. We had made it through 5 weeks of play. We had a 10-week season, relatively short, and 2 weeks of playoffs. We had made it through week 5 of our season, and we're doing relatively well. We had some solid TV ratings on Fox and ESPN. Our attendance at most of our sites was pretty solid. The quality of play had gotten a good bit better since week 1. So I think we were on a little bit of a roll, and we had a big decision. Could we play week 6, the slate of games for week 6? The first game for that weekend was a game out in Seattle. And, there were, the world was shutting down, as you had mentioned. And, we had to deal with television partners, of course, and they have personnel, and those personnel were concerned about going to Seattle. If you remember, Seattle was one of the early hotspots, right, for the virus. We had players that all of a sudden had concerns about traveling. There was just a myriad of concerns that existed. And ultimately, we were not able to make week 6. The NBA shut down, the NHL shut down. You mentioned, the tournament was called off. And it was just an incredible sort of deflation of everybody's spirit, that had worked for so hard, in many cases, some folks for, a couple of years leading up to that launch. But everybody was deflated across the sports spectrum, whether it was professional sports or amateur sports. And I remember saying to myself, as a leader, I said, I can't, show my staff how disappointed I am. Of course, everybody assumed you're saddened by not being able to continue to play, but you also have to put on an upbeat face, particularly, with a startup like what we had. So we had an all-staff meeting that next day and kind of walked through, what happened and why. But I was so focused on trying to make sure that I was staying positive enough without being just a sort of false cheerleader, if you will, right? And that's, I think, part of sort of leadership in these turbulent times, is you have to find that right balance between being honest and candid with staff. And people aren't stupid. They see what's happening around them. But ultimately, leaders have to supply a level of confidence and a level of optimism and a belief that, we too can get out of this. This too shall pass, and we can move on. So that's something that I think really applies at all different levels. Doesn't mean if you have to be the CEO or the top dog in an organization. It filters all the way down to really some of the junior level staffers, because everybody looks to everybody else, and by and large, people want to be around folks that believe at least that they see a vision and a way out of the current situation.
Absolutely. And I completely believe that, sports really kind of was the view into what was going to happen at the broader level, just across the world. And, I think why that week became so real and became such the defining point for so many people is I live here in New York City, and I remember just walking outside and walking around the street and hearing people, just random people on the street, talking about, oh my God, they canceled the NBA, they canceled NCAA. Like, that moment felt like a very visceral moment. It felt like it became real for everybody, for the general public. And I think that really speaks to how sports really transcends almost everything, and people can really understand the impact. Once everything stopped with sports, it felt like that was kind of the catalyst for everything else.
Sure. Well, sports is a part of our culture, obviously. I think we're probably one of the most, if not the most, sport fascinated, countries in this globe of ours. And we've taken it for granted. We take it for granted every year that there's a season. We take for granted every year that our kids can compete in youth sports and can burn off all that energy they have when they come home from school. So we take all of that obviously for granted. And when it really is shut down, I think the last time most folks could remember, at least older folks, was maybe during the war years when, or back in 1918, not many of us around that witnessed that, when we had another pandemic. But it's something that we take for granted. And I think there's some positive in having something taken away, even if it's just temporarily, because you really realize how much it means to you as a coach, as a player, as a fan, as an administrator. You really realize that, oh my gosh, this is my livelihood. And if it doesn't exist, I have to sort of question a lot of different things. But I'm sure you did that, right, with what you're doing for Athletes First and the brands that you work with and all the athletes. I certainly did that, given, my sort of experience over the years with professional and college sports. But it all of a sudden makes you truly realize how important something like that is to you, and how important it is to other people. That's critical.
Yeah. Well, I certainly, from the standpoint of, dealing with brands, I think if I had to, pick one word, it would be uncertainty, right? And the fact that brands are managing to the next day. They're no longer able to say, well, I know what's going to happen in the next 6 months, so here's how I'm going to spend my marketing dollars. So as kind of putting that into the collegiate setting, whether that's on the academic side or whether that's on the athletic side, one of the things from a leadership perspective, especially, is you're managing with an unprecedented level of uncertainty. So, putting yourself, you've obviously worn a lot of different shoes as an athlete, as a coach, as an administrator. How do we think about managing uncertainty, particularly in a time like this, and particularly with very young people as athletes, as student athletes?
I think there are a couple of things that one can do, but the first, I think, thing that any leader needs to do, and again, at any level, is to accept that there's uncertainty. And, you try to sort of peek around the corner into the future and see what things may look like. But I think it requires a certain level of humility to say, I don't know. I don't know what the future necessarily will hold, but collectively as a group, your team, your entire athletic department staff, your university, you can begin to shape that future. And that's the fun part, right? So it's not helplessly looking on, but it's beginning to understand where you may have a lever or two to begin to shape that future. And I think it's important as you go through that sort of uncertain time to really over communicate, right? I mentioned earlier about sort of injuries. We all have faced injuries. You missed time, I'm sure, as a gymnast in college. I missed plenty of time as a football player. And you never quite know when you might be back. You might even get conflicting opinions from a team doctor or a doctor from your hometown that you may have visited because you weren't quite sure if you were getting the best advice. So you'll get some conflicting opinions, but I think it's critical, to over communicate for a coach to over communicate with a player that may be injured or may be out for a while, right? Don't let that young person sort of sink into that funk of, oh my gosh, I'm not sure when I can play. I'm not sure if there's even going to be a season. I wonder why I'm doing all of this. And I think that applies as well to staff people, as an AD or an associate AD, move around your campus, visit with the assistant equipment manager, make sure that he or she is feeling okay and upbeat, right? Because people do get depressed when they don't have that rhythm and they don't have that Saturday afternoon football game or the Monday evening, basketball game or whatever it would be. So I think over communicating is important, and you don't have to spend a whole lot of time necessarily with each individual person. Some departments are massive, but if you're, managing 10 or 15 or 20 people, it's good to touch base and let them know that, hey, I don't really know either what the future is going to hold, but I think together we can figure this out. I got pretty good confidence level that we'll figure this out and do the right thing. I think the other thing that's interesting is when there is uncertain times, I think people tend to sort of fall back on some of the core values. Like, why are we really in intercollegiate athletics, And the reason ultimately is to serve young men and young women, give them a great experience, teach them lessons that I really don't think can be taught anywhere else except, on the court, in the pool, on the basketball diamond, on the baseball diamond, et cetera. So I think sometimes you can fall back a little bit on some of the values, and maybe a brand even kind of falls back on some of its values, and they have to ask themselves as brand managers, what do we really stand for in the long term or in the midterm? Because we really don't know what's going to happen tomorrow or next week. So sort of falling back in those very traditional, solid values, I think, is part of what one has to do when they're going through sort of some uncertain times.
Yeah. So there's two things that really resonated with what you just said. So I think the first one is that this idea of how do you keep people together? We're in a virtual world now. Back when I was competing in gymnastics, so much of what we did was the bonding that happened in the gym, in the training room, at training table. Now that's effectively gone, at least temporarily. And whether that happens in the office or whether that happens in the gym, whether that happens on campus, we're operating in a virtual world. So I really like, what you're saying about over communicating and transparency is the key. Now we have to kind of take it to a new level because there is just not physical presence right now in most places. So I think that's really important.
Yeah, and I think there are certain people, I'd like to think I was this way where, in the olden days, right, before the pandemic, you would sort of, it's the equivalent of walking the shop floor to talk to folks to find out, what was happening at your business within your industry. You walk down the hallway, you pop your head in, just say hello for 30 seconds to talk to the assistant tennis coach or, talk to, one of the academic advisors and just sort of ask, how you doing? How's your family? Everything okay? But now in the Zoom world, you have to be much more purposeful, right? You really have to decide, okay, I'm going to make, 5 phone calls, individually chat with folks, right? And that's a skill that one has to develop, right? It's sort of like what you had said earlier, Jene, about, beginning to work different muscles, right? To maybe overcome, an injury or so. And I think in this era, we all have to be pretty candid with ourselves and also pretty humble that, yeah, I might need to be more purposeful. I might need to, say to myself, I'm going to make 10 phone calls a day and just touch base with people for, no more than 2 or 3 minutes. I was a political candidate years ago in a failed race. I lost. But one of the things I took away was during the campaign when all these campaign experts tell you that, in order to raise money, you've got to, say to yourself every day, I'm going to call 10 donors and raise, X number of dollars, whatever that is. And I won't stop calling until I reach that level. And that's, I think, in a sense, the kind of sort of approach you may need to take in this virtual world where we just don't see each other in the hallway anymore, or don't see each other in the break room. And those are meaningful conversations. They may be short, they may be sort of trite, but I think they're very meaningful conversations, no matter where you are. Again, in the the university or the athletic department hierarchy.
Yeah, and I think one of the things, speaking of that, I think, as a former athlete, I had a chance, like everybody else did at the beginning of this sort of pandemic. Everyone was on Zoom reunion calls for every excuse you could think of, right? So I have found also with athletes, particularly student athletes who are used to a very disciplined kind of lifestyle, this can also be really challenging when you don't really have the guardrails that you had before. And so now you've got athletes that are coming back to campus again. There's a lot of uncertainty. The days probably are not laid out as clearly as they used to be. So talk a little bit about how you manage that aspect of it, the sort of the discipline piece, and encouraging people to, exactly as you say, to stick with the routine, whether it's calling a certain number of clients a day, or whether it's checking in with a certain number of athletes a day, or your employees.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that there's a couple of things. One, it's important, right, to try to keep those traditional daily or weekly or monthly events going on, even if it is over Zoom. I mean, in a sense, it's remarkable how quickly everybody has adopted to the various platforms that people are using for for virtual meetings. So I think it's important to keep that that sort of connection going. That's important as well for coaches who have spent a good bit of time teaching over Zoom, or putting game plans in, or lesson plans, if you will, over Zoom. So I think that's critical. I also think that ultimately, one-on-one conversations are important, as well. Certainly with student athletes, who are young. They're 17, 18, 19, obviously 20 years old, whatever. This is probably the first time they've gone through something really strange like this, in the length of the pandemic. I guess I compare it again to the sort of injury thing where, a young person can lose a bunch of confidence if you're not able to compete, if you're not, out there training, or you're not at 100%. And that's important. If there's one good thing that may have come out of all of this is a renewed, or maybe not even renewed, maybe just for the first time, a focus on mental health of particularly of student athletes, but not just student athletes, all of us that are dealing with this pandemic. And, how do people relax? How do they recover their sort of sense of normalcy a little bit, or get a little bit of the endorphins going, and feel good about themselves after sitting for whatever 8 hours on Zoom calls on a daily basis. So I think sort of this focus, maybe not renewed, but this focus on mental health, it may be good coming out of this, that all of us, right, from the top on down, are much more aware and sensitive to the mental health of student athletes and how important that is. And it's not just important for themselves as human beings, but I firmly believe, you would probably agree, you perform better when you're feeling good, right? When you just have a good level of self-confidence, and you feel like you're in control of your environment, more or less, and your academics are going okay. You don't have to worry about those while you're out on at practice or during a game. I mean, it's nice to be able to clear your head and really focus on the sport. So I think this concept that, hey, let's be a little bit more sensitive to mental health might be one of the few positives coming out of the pandemic.
I would agree with that. And I think that goes to, the second point that you brought up a little bit ago about how do you adapt, in some way, and really kind of get to the core of what truly matters. So for brands, you see a lot of brands that are coming back to a really positive message. There's a lot now that's happening in cause marketing. There are a lot of brands that are saying, what do we truly stand for? And from a mental health perspective, that's one of the consistently identified as one of the top challenges and issues with students and student athletes. You're a student, and then on top of that, you got another job, which is being an athlete. And I think that is, I love your point about that, because I think that, we kind of people knew that it was out there, but I think it got a little bit brushed under the rug because there were just so many other things going on. And now it's really kind of putting on display, how do you really manage to help people manage their stress levels and help people manage their mental health.
No, that's right. And I would add, sort of one more layer to all of this, which really in a sense is remarkable, which is, the social justice concerns that exist, right? And throughout the country at all sort of different levels. And that's causing, I think, additional stress, right? So just beyond the pandemic and not being able to participate, not knowing if the season's going to happen or how long it may happen. If can I play 7 games or is it 11 or 12? And all of that certainly creates a level of stress and anxiety. But I think, certainly for a lot of young college athletes, as they look around the country, I think there's a real issue of what can I do to help, move this country forward and get past a lot of the turmoil, and even just to talk about that, right? To talk about that, over the training room table or in the training room itself, or in the locker room, right? Where all those great conversations historically have taken place. It's almost incumbent upon us as leaders and adults, right, in the collegiate world, to create those platforms where kids can communicate, even if it's virtual, because that's an important part of college. It's an important part of growing up. I truly can't imagine looking back at my 4 years of college and not having all that camaraderie in the locker room, in the training room, on game day, at practice, all the joking, all the laughing, all the teasing, all the great moments, all the low moments, right? All the emotion. And, that keeps people going, certainly kept me going as a student athlete. So I think when you add that extra layer of what's happening around the country, I think it really should make all of us, stand up straight, or sit up straight in our chairs and say, well, we've got to make sure we have appropriate platforms. Forget about the sport, forget about the game plan, forget about whether practice is going to take place tomorrow or not. Let's talk, and because that's important as well. Every team is a family for a kid, no matter where you come from, white, black, rural, urban, doesn't matter. It's a family. Coaches talk about it, almost ad nauseum, but it really is a family. When that family can't get together, it's tough.
Absolutely. And, when the family is hurting, you have to address that. And so I like the fact that you brought up the social justice piece, because what I find is really interesting is how, whether it's coaches, whether it's administrators, whether it's academic leaders, are really kind of bridging the gap with athletes who, you're exactly right, feel such a desire to make some sort of a difference, to make some sort of a statement. And I really haven't seen that, before, where athletes and coaches, yes, it happens in the locker room, always has, but now that it's happening, much more publicly, I think that's also really interesting. And it is important for the coaches and the administrators to understand what their role is in helping athletes feel, or student athletes, giving them a safe space to kind of be who they are and express what they need to express.
Well, I think back, to, that camaraderie in the locker room, right? And if that's all of a sudden just taken away from a young man, from a young woman, again, doesn't matter where that person may have come from, what the background is, but when that's taken away, that's critical. That's sort of a vital organ in the body, if you will. And, so it's hard to recreate it, but I think, again, everybody should really think about ways that can be recreated, even at, sort of a minimalistic level, because it is so important. I learned life lessons in the locker room, more so than maybe I learned, academically, or, attending law school, right? You learn life lessons in the locker room. There are raw emotions. You have to learn leadership. You have to learn how to also be a follower in the locker room, right? So, taking that away is something that really, can hurt, so we just have to be sensitive to that, I think, and figure out ways, working with a whole bunch of different people on your campus, your medical staff, psychologists, how to best recreate that, so that, kids do in fact stay engaged and don't sort of, feel as though they're a little bit directionless, right? Coaches love to give direction. Athletes typically need direction so that they, can lead that sort of structured lifestyle. And you pull out some of that structure, you pull out, one or two of those underpinnings, and it can really have a negative effect.
Yeah. And you talk about pulling together different sort of levers of support for athletes. There are multiple stakeholders, obviously, that are involved in any athletic department, any athletic program. So talk a little bit about sort of, bringing those groups together. As you mentioned, there are academics, there are doctors, there are, donors, boosters. Everybody kind of is in some way, shape, or form involved with what's happening on campus. And so how do you think about, as a leader, what is your responsibility to sort of make sure that all stakeholders are heard and are effective for what we ultimately need, which is to best support our student athletes?
That's a great question. And I guess I would answer it by starting with this, which is, having been involved in professional sports, whether it's with the XFL or the NFL or MLS, I always thought that, a professional sports executive lived more or less in a binary world, right? Two things matter, in professional sports. Number one, are you winning more games? And if you're not, why not? And number two, can you make more money? Right? It's really those two questions that, sort of every day drive the business. College athletics, on the other side of that fence is fundamentally different, with so many different constituencies, and you named a bunch of them, but also include parents in there, include the high school community, right? Because obviously, college coaches live and die with recruiting and high school relationships. So there's probably a dozen legitimate constituencies that any athletic director at big school, small school, doesn't matter, has to deal with. And that includes even, folks that are associate or assistant ADs as they deal with, the various constituencies. So I think the first thing is to recognize all those constituencies, to understand that they too have a stake. They're stakeholders. They have a voice in all this that happens. If you're at a public school, guess what? Your state government may have a say in what happens on your campus. And
I think
got all of those sort of constituencies. Sorry, and you have to accept those. And again, you have to over communicate. And even if it's taking some of the booster clubs and doing Zoom calls with some of those, boosters, or engaging parents, right? We saw some of the parents in the Big Ten before they announced that they were going to start playing football again. Some of the parents were, protesting in front of the Big Ten headquarters or in front of the various. So, there's issues like that are very challenging, obviously, but over communication, even if you're not quite sure sort of where this will all go, I think it just helps to talk to folks, to let them know that you're thinking about it, you're doing the absolute best. Sorry, I have to apologize.
A Zoom call is never complete until there is a
right.
technical.
No, there's always one. I thought it was going to be my 10-month-old granddaughter, but
I thought it was going to be my cat.
A buddy of mine. So I apologize, Jene,
Not a
and
problem.
to all the listeners and viewers. Sorry.
Okay, so we were talking about sort of the various different constituencies, and kind of how we think about, I liken it a little bit to, being in sales, being in marketing. You're dealing with clients every day, and the worst thing that you can do at any point in time is sort of just drop out of the picture and then expect to re-engage 6 months later. And so I really like what you're saying about, we can't just assume that we've got to try and barrel through. Part of leadership means taking care of all of the different constituencies, all of the different support groups, because you're going to have to go back and re-engage, hopefully not too far down the road, but we don't know. But I think it is really important. It's almost, you almost shift from sort of managing day-to-day operations just to thinking about how do I just keep people engaged.
No, that's right. People care about college athletics. They care about pro athletics. They care about youth sports as well. It matters obviously to a lot of different folks, and being able to sort of have all these different constituencies realize, okay, this is very challenging right now. There are a lot of unanswered questions. I mean, who knows? We might be in this a year from now with sort of the same situation, with maybe limited fans in the stands, or not sure if we can continue to play games. So this could go on much longer than we think. But I think what's important is so that the constituents really appreciate that and hang in there, and don't sort of say to themselves, it's just not worth it. I'm going to stop following that program, or I'm going to stop being engaged, or I'm going to stop donating if it would, because it's hard to get that person back on board, right? It's hard to get that group back on board. It's hard to rebuild that sort of confidence level. And that's a lot of work. It's a lot of good old fashioned hard work, disciplined work, talking to people. Again, like a political candidate, you got to raise a certain amount of money per day, or else you won't be able to pay the bills. You got to pull your TV ads the last 2 weeks of the campaign. That's hard. And you have to really motivate yourself and to do that. And where that motivation comes from, I think is sort of that bigger picture of what you want to return to. So I've always, envisioned in myself, gosh, the moment you walk into a stadium and it's sold out and there's, 48,000 people there and that's loud, that's going to happen again, right? So let's make sure that first game back, when you're able to sell every seat, that's the spirit that you have. Or, from the gymnastics world, when you go to a place like Utah, where there's just an incredible fan base and there's 15,000 people, watching a dual meet, and you say to yourself, that's what you live for as an athlete, as a coach, as an administrator, to see that kind of support. So it's always been helpful to me to sort of keep that vision of what you ultimately want to return to. And to return to it, you have to kind of keep everybody, during this, I'm not sure what even to call it, during this slump, during this hiatus, you have to kind of keep them all as engaged as is humanly possible.
Absolutely. One other thing I'd love to get your take on, in the middle of 2020, the other thing that's going on, it's also causing a certain level of, there is a certain level of uncertainty with it. It is certainly staying on the burner for now is the whole NIL discussion in college. And I know you've been at the forefront of that. And one of the things from a leadership perspective is, how do you best help athletes kind of manage all of this, understanding, when you talk about, the mental health and wellness of athletes, this is potentially another really good opportunity for athletes, but it's also something from the administrator's perspective that everyone just has to be aware of, and how you best support it and how you best support your athletes. I think that it's also something, again, that athletes are just very aware of. There seems to be just, a level of savvy about athletes as a brand that there may not have been, 10, 15 years ago. So can you talk a little bit about that in terms of managing what right now is uncertainty in that space, and what ideally, administrators should be on the lookout for in terms of how they best should support their athletes?
Sure. Well, I would say that name, image, likeness, NIL, is a fundamental shift in how an athlete will look at his or her experience and opportunity, during the 4 or 5 or plus, even 5+ years on a campus. Because for the first time, really, in the 150 years of college athletics, it's the first time that a student beginning in the summer of 21 will have the ability and the right to monetize his or her name, image, and likeness. That's a major shift, right? That's a shift that, hardly could have been contemplated maybe 30 or 40 years ago, but, it's happening. States have passed laws. There have been bills introduced in Congress to sort of, have a consistent approach across the nation. There's a lot of things still in flux, but the fact of the matter is it will happen. I think it's a great sort of new, robust component of the athletic experience in college. And I think young men and young women will be smart to think about it, look at it, try to take advantage of it, but also not let it sort of control the college experience, right? You were a gymnast at a great institution. I was a football player. 4 years, you were busy, practice,
Very
and,
busy.
and academics, and you want to have a little bit of a personal life. And now there's another element that's sort of brought in there, which is the ability to go out and and raise money, generate revenue off of your name, image, and likeness. You shouldn't let any one of those components overwhelm the others, right? Because part of, I think, the beauty of being a student athlete is the ability to do multiple things. To be a great student, to be a great athlete, to be a great person in terms of your personal life and meet people and take advantage of the university environment. So this other component, is important, and folks absolutely should take advantage of it, but they should also be smart and not let it overwhelm any of the other components. It's all about keeping things in balance. And I think that's important. I think for administrators, it's a big shift. I'm not sure I can emphasize how different, life may be on a campus within an athletic department when all of a sudden you may have 30 or 40 or 50 or 60 of your student athletes who have legitimate profiles and are out there doing things, whether it's social media, where they're endorsing a product, some of the brands that you work with, or they're doing an autograph session, or they're attending a birthday party for a 10-year-old kid, or they're, coming together with 3 or 4 of their teammates, and they're teaching middle schoolers on a Sunday afternoon how to hit a curveball, right? Because these are great college baseball players, and they certainly know how to hit a curveball. So it's a very big sort of space that's opening up really with one fell swoop in the summer of 21. A lot of sort of education that I think, administrators have to do. Coaches need to wrap their brains around the fact that, a student athlete now has a fundamental right to go out and monetize the name, image, and likeness. And what's happening, I think, and this, Jene, from your work as well, because of the pandemic, because of the social justice concerns that are out there, because of the financial sort of concerns that exist without fall football or limited fall football and the revenue hits that schools are taking, hardly anybody is really focused on the name, image, likeness piece. That's just now beginning to sort of get some discussion and attention within departments. So long story short, I think a lot of work, has to be done between now and the summer of 21. And that includes the folks at the NCAA, promulgating the final rules. They aren't set yet. So, many campuses, every campus theoretically is waiting for those final rules so that they know what can a compliance officer do and what can't a compliance officer do. What can an AD or another, administrator do, and what cannot that administrator do. So there'll be some fine lines, but it's a big shift. No question about it. I think it can be a shift for the good. Right? I think it can be a bonus, a plus at the end of the day for college athletes and for all the programs and the coaches. But it has to be managed well. And that's obviously incumbent upon everybody who's involved in the intercollegiate ecosystem.
Absolutely. And I think that's what, a lot of the, as we talk about leadership, a lot of what this does come down to is figuring out how you can best provide support. Because I think, thinking back, it's a while ago now on my gymnastics. my gymnastic days, the student piece of it, the social piece, the athletic piece, and now even the idea of adding in another layer. So, adding another piece to the pie. I don't think I could have done that if I hadn't had support. I mean, I happened to be at Stanford at a time where the athletic department was just incredible, and the level of support there was really incredible. And thinking about, as people kind of think about name, image, and likeness, or any other piece that is developing within an institution, none of it happens in a vacuum, and all of it kind of affects everybody, because everyone has to figure out kind of what role they play in supporting the holistic athlete, because that is really the goal, right? Is to make sure that the people coming through your college or university are the best people at the end of the day they can possibly be.
Sure. I mean, I think that the vast majority of people who are working, in an athletic department, whether they're coaches or administrators, academic advisors, right, all the different functions, I really do think the vast majority are there because they want to help young people, right? They want to see a young person come in as a freshman, wide-eyed, bushy-tailed, naive, and walk out of there 4 or 5, whatever years later, maybe with a master's degree, certainly with an undergraduate degree, having had a great experience. And a great experience doesn't always mean just winning every game or match or whatever. It means, growing as a human being, learning how to discipline oneself, learning how to be a member of a team, learning how to win with grace, and learning how to lose with dignity, because we all, at some point will lose games and not have a good performance. Those are all lessons that are critical. So I think with this new NIL ecosystem, that I think the vast majority of athletic department personnel will want to help. They'll want to see student athletes take advantage of it, but make sure it doesn't overwhelm other parts of that, that daily experience. That's important. It's all about, things in balance. It's the golden mean in my mind. I've always viewed it that way. Keep everything sort of in balance. And if it's in balance, you'll be able to manage it all, even a number of different components like every student athlete has. So I'm excited about, this new ecosystem. I think it's going to be fascinating. There's lots of things that could happen between now and the summer of 21, but there really is a marvelous opportunity for student athletes. And I think as well for the programs, for the schools, for the athletic departments to help where they can, but let's not, of course, walk over that line that the NCAA will draw.
Absolutely. Well, I think I want to make sure we have some time for Q&A, because I could talk to you all day long. But I am going to see if we can maybe start the Q&A session now. So we have a couple.
Awesome. Yeah.
All right. So Katie, I don't know if you're there. There you are.
Sure. All right. Thanks, Jene. We do have a couple of questions here, but I just want to remind our folks that are joining us on Zoom that if you do have a question, to please go ahead and submit that in the Q&A feature of your Zoom toolbar. But to start out here, and both of you feel free to answer this, but who is the best leader you've worked for or with, and why? And what stands out about him or her?
Jene, I'll let you take this one first.
All right. Yeah. So I would say, I had the good fortune to work at the NBA. I started in 2013. I was based overseas, but I came in right as Adam Silver was starting his first year as commissioner, and I think I've been really, really proud of the time that I was there. I was at the NBA for 5 years, a little over 5 years. And one of the things that was really powerful for me is to just see Adam as a leader who is not only incredibly transparent, obviously, very sort of forward thinking, really kind of got the NBA to a level both in the personal space and the professional space. I mean, he's just been, as far as I can see, and as far as I've experienced, I was really proud to say that I worked there. And part of the reason is because of Adam, and because of the level of transparency and the level of support and the relationship that he has with the players and the players union and all of the constituencies, the teams that he works with, and a lot of what we talked about, Oliver, a lot of those leadership skills in terms of communicating and being very clear, putting a stake in the ground, not apologizing for it, being very, and taking ownership too, taking ownership of every single decision he made. I was very grateful to be a part of that whole experience.
That's great. Adam clearly is an awesome leader, and I'm not sure that anybody has done a better job in the pandemic in the sports world of, shepherding his organization through all these travails. So I'll answer very quickly. When I was still working for the Houston Dynamo, I was asked to join the West Virginia University Board of Governors, Board of Trustees, right? Board of Regents, different name. And we hired a president. His name was Jim Clements, and he served there for a number of years. He's now the president of Clemson University. But Jim was an absolutely awesome leader. He brought me on as athletic director. And really between the two of us, we were able to do something that was critically important for my alma mater, West Virginia University, which was to move out of the old Big East, if you remember that conference, which had seen a number of defections. Miami had left, Virginia Tech had left, Boston College had left, Syracuse had left. So there, it was really some crumbling, if you will. And we had a very stressful time period leading us into the Big 12, which I think was a marvelous conference for a school like West Virginia with, schools like, from Texas and Oklahoma and elsewhere. But the leadership that Jim exhibited, dealing really with the academic side and the political side, and then with me on the athletic side and on the political side as well, because we all know that college athletics can get a little bit political, was a great lesson for me, and thoroughly enjoyed that experience working with Jim. Like you had said about Adam, somebody that always had your back. You felt very comfortable. You were willing to take certainly a risk, right? Because you're putting yourself out there, certainly, with this issue of college realignment and where schools may end up. But that was a leader I really, really enjoyed working for. And I was I was kind of proud to have, along with many others, hired him, but then to have gone to work for him was kind of a nice little, dynamic sort of spirit, if you will. So that would be my response to that very good question.
This next question is for you, Oliver. Most times as a leader, you need to think outside the box to find an all-encompassing solution to problems. Can you talk about some of the out-of-the-box platforms or initiatives you created during the early days of the XFL?
Yeah, so there was a lot of out-of-the-box thinking that we thought was appropriate, right, for a startup league. We were able to do things a little bit differently. We weren't sort of, tied down so much by tradition. So, we spent a good bit of time looking at football rules, right? Not many folks get, all that granular with the rules of any particular sport. But we really spent a lot of time not just looking at the rules, but asking football fans, pro and college, what they liked, what they didn't like. If they could start a brand new league, how would they change the game? What new rule would they put in? What rule would they take out? What's a sort of a time waster? The games change over decades, and the game that is being played right now at the college level looks much different than what the game was when I was in school. Right? It's a passing game. Quarterbacks are throwing for 600 and 700 yards a game. That was half a season, back in the 1980s, and the rules have allowed for that. So, we felt as though we could come up with a different kickoff, which we did, or come up with a different play clock. Ours was a 25-second play clock compared to the NFL's 40-second play clock. We wired virtually everybody on the field, players, referees, coaches, to get that sort of dialogue that normally a fan doesn't hear. And I think people like that as well. So doing all of that, but keeping one thing in mind, which we didn't want to do, we didn't want to bring any kind of a gimmick into the game. People respect the games too much. They respect the sport too much, whether it's football or any other sport. They respect it too much to make it gimmicky, but they are willing, I think, to entertain innovations that make some sense. So all of the rule changes that we made, we believe were grounded sort of in solid data, and were grounded in sort of the desire of the fans to see that. And we believe were improvements to what we consider to be a great game already. As we like to say, we made football not great, but we gave it just a little bit of pepper and salt to make it even better than it is. So that's a fun thing to do. And you have to trust, I think, your instincts a little bit in terms of making innovations, because you don't want to do silly things or as we said, gimmicky things. But try to keep some sort of barriers in place, some guardrails where you don't fall into that gimmicky space, because that's, once you get into that gimmicky space, you tend, I think, to lose credibility.
Great. Well, the next question here, both of you feel free to answer this. And you talked a little bit about it when you were at the point in the conversation and you mentioned student athlete health and wellness. We know that there's a great deal of pressure on those that are in leadership roles. So what are some examples of practices you have implemented in your own life and career to ensure you're staying physically, mentally, and emotionally as healthy as possible?
Go ahead, Jene.
Okay, so let's see. So, I'm always a big believer. I've been a big believer in yoga, meditation. I've actually been doing that for several years. I think one of the things that was a benefit for me as soon as the pandemic hit, I had spent, the better part of probably 10 years on traveling on airplanes, 20, 25 weeks out of the year. And so what happened for me was that I was able to just stop and breathe a little bit. And I started really kind of exploring I was actually left the city for several months and moved a little further upstate New York, and just really taking walks every day, taking the pets out for walks, rediscovering. And I am fully convinced that the people that have had sort of the best lockdown experience has by far and away been pets. So I really, just kind of taking time to do the things that I really didn't do, because we're all in this career where it's crazy, it's intense, we're on the road a lot, we're taking care of clients, we're taking care of constituents, we're taking care of our employees. So I actually schedule time in now for meditation, and then for walks. I don't know what I'm going to do in the winter when the winter hits, but so far that's been working pretty well.
So I would say that, again, as we talked about a little bit earlier, in times of uncertainty, you go back to sort of those important values, baseline values. And I think that for me to sort of clear my head, I do the same things that I did when I was a 12-year-old kid growing up in Cleveland, which is get outside and ride your bike, find a couple of friends to go shoot hoops or play baseball catch. In the wintertime, I know what I'm going to be doing, which is going skiing, because even in Ohio, northeastern Ohio, we had enough elevation to do that. And you go back to the things you really care about. You love your family, right? So I've been fortunate enough to spend a lot of time during the pandemic with my wife, obviously my kids, and we got our first granddaughter, 10-month-old. But it's all those things that matter. And it's sort of like that book, right? You learned everything you need to know in kindergarten. I think it's really those things that you would have done if you were 12 or 13 or 14 years old, because those are the things that just gave you a certain level of pleasure. So I'm doing those same things, quite honestly, 45 years later. And they do help me, clear my head and kind of just feel good about my ability to sort of master all these crazy things that are happening, at least to some degree, so that you feel like you have a little bit of control over your destiny.
Great. Well, last question from me before I turn it back over to you, Jene, as we near the end of the session today. But we've heard before that leaders are readers. So do you both have any book recommendations that you can offer for those joining us today?
Well, I just turned around and got one off of my little bookshelf. I don't know if you can see it. It's a fascinating story about World War I in the Brits and the devastation, right, in Europe during the war, 1914 to 1918. But out of that devastation grew this incredibly intense desire to figure out how to climb Mount Everest. And those who are kind of familiar with the story, know of a very famous but ill-fated expedition, the Mallory Irvine expedition in the 1920s, that they don't know if they made it to the top. They certainly didn't make it down alive if they did make it to the top. But it was just, it's a great story. I'm halfway through, about incredible physical toughness and what they did, with the equipment of that era to, even consider, getting up to the peak of the world. So this is the book that I am currently reading. Jene?
So I am, my obsession is more to the audio side. So podcasts, I'm a big fan of podcasts. There's two in particular that I'm listening to right now that I just find fascinating. One, because I am a student of history, and I'm fascinated by it. One is called Wicked Games, and it's kind of the history of political elections all the way ultimately up until this election, but just seeing how the United States has sort of evolved over the year, really since the beginning, since the beginning of the US has been, really interesting. And then another one is called Business Wars. Business Wars is a really great it's a really great listen because it gives you this, they talk about sort of two different businesses. So for example, Netflix and Blockbuster, and looking at kind of where they went right and where they maybe didn't go so right. And Nike and Adidas, talking about sort of the two sort of contrasting businesses. And there's a lot of sort of leadership, there were a lot of key decisions that were made with several of these businesses. And I love the way that the story is told. It's a really, really engaging series. So those would be my two recommendations.
Great. Well, Jene, I'll turn it back over to you as we conclude today's session.
Fantastic. So we are exactly 1 minute over, but Oliver, I really wanted to thank you again for your time and sharing a couple of pearls of wisdom. I think that every single time we can learn something and we can take away a few nuggets from you. I think we're all better for it. So just thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you, Jene. You did an awesome job as well. And let me thank Katie and Bob and all the good folks at NACDA. And happy to do it. And hopefully we'll do this at some point in the future.
Hopefully, and hopefully we'll do it in person as well.
That's right. That'd be even better. But I guess we'll sign off.
Yes,
Thanks
we will
very
sign
much.
off now.
Appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Jene and Oliver, thank you very much. Really appreciate your time today. Over communicate, be transparent, and everyone take some me time. It's important to have that me time, get away and clear your minds. But really appreciate the time you both gave us today, and all of you out there who are with us. Thanks for joining, and all of you be safe. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thanks, Bob.
Bye.